58 years elapsed between the violent destruction of the heavy cruiser Haguro in the spring of 1945 and her acoustic rediscovery in 2003. She vanished during one of the last major ship-to-ship surface actions of the Second World War. When she went down in the Malacca Strait, more than 900 men were lost with her. The scale of that loss gave the wreck a grave site significance, but the legal barrier did not arise from casualties alone. Haguro remained a sunken Japanese warship, a state vessel whose ownership and immunity were not erased by sinking. Any later documentation or salvage therefore required respect for both the war grave character of the site and the flag state's continuing rights. Investigating the cruiser meant working under a non-recovery, non-disturbance ethic, rather than treating the wreck as abandoned metal. To understand the scope of the forensic challenge, the mechanism of her sinking must be established. The event was designated Operation Dukedom. On May 16, 1945, a flotilla of 5 British destroyers executed a synchronized night ambush. The heavy cruiser was caught in a narrow channel. The destroyers launched a coordinated torpedo attack from multiple angles. Torpedoes exploit the violence of an underwater blast. When a warhead detonates against or near the lower hull, shock and gas pulse loading pass through the surrounding water into the plating, torpedo bulges, and internal framing, tearing structure open and driving flooding through vulnerable compartments. Haguro absorbed multiple direct hits. The exact number remains a subject of analysis, but the immediate structural consequences were catastrophic. The explosive force devastated the forward section of the ship. She lost way, flooded heavily, and went down bow first. The violence of that night left a sprawling, shattered wreck locked in the dark. For decades, the exact coordinates and physical condition of the ship remained a mystery. When specialized search teams finally located and confirmed the wreck, they faced a complex operational paradox. The objective was to achieve positive visual identification and secure a structural baseline of the battle damage. They needed to understand how the massive hull yielded to the torpedo strikes. They needed to map the surviving evidence of destruction. The evidence would have to come from observation, photography, and mapping alone. That status translated directly into field rules. There could be no artifact recovery, no intrusive sampling, and no dismantling of the structure to test metal fatigue. The divers could not conduct a systematic internal penetration to trace flooding paths or measure hidden blast deformation. Where collapsed or open structures could be seen, they could be recorded. Anything sealed behind bulkheads or buried under wreckage remained out of reach. The investigation had to remain observational and non-recovery, with usable data drawn only from what the team could see and record. This restraint defined the operational logic of the survey. The engineers and marine archaeologists had to build a complete picture of a complex dynamic event using only static exterior evidence. They had to read the bent steel, the collapsed superstructures, and the torn hull plating from a respectful distance. It was a forensic mission governed by a rigid legal and ethical boundary. That operating framework created a strict proof ceiling from the very beginning. The boundary of the war grave forced the team to accept that some mechanical questions would simply remain unanswered. The team prepared to deploy to the Malacca Strait, knowing their exact limitations. They had the coordinates. They understood the legal parameters. The central question was no longer where the cruiser was located. The question was how the final structural state of the shattered vessel could be accurately documented without violating the resting place of 900 casualties. At the site, that limit became physical. Extreme depth and legal protection pressed on the team at the same time. The primary environmental limit was the resting depth. The sea floor in this sector of the strait lies at about 220 feet, roughly 68 meters. That depth is far beyond ordinary recreational, no decompression diving. Operating there requires technical profiles, disciplined decompression schedules, and gas management procedures that may involve mixed gas, rebreathers, or carefully planned open-circuit support. The water pressure compressed the available working time into a narrow, unforgiving window. Every minute spent observing the wreck on the bottom had to be paid back during a slow, staged ascent, making bottom time the site's most precious and rapidly vanishing resource. Compounding the depth penalty was a lethal local hazard. Over the decades, the massive steel footprint of the wreck acted as an immense snag for commercial fishing trawlers dragging their gear through the strait. The hull was heavily entangled in discarded fishing nets. These heavy synthetic webs draped across the superstructure, shrouded the gun batteries, and drifted off the torn edges of the deck. In the dim light of 220 feet, fishing nets present a severe, sometimes invisible threat. A diver moving along the wreck could easily become ensnared. At that pressure, a fouled diver faces an immediate survival crisis. The instinct to cut away obstacles is overwhelming. However, the expedition was governed by a strict legal boundary that severely restricted how they could interact with both the wreck and the debris covering it. The issue was not ownership theory, but field conduct around a protected war grave. The result was a hard operational line. Emergency self-rescue was permitted, but site alteration was not. The same line governed every survey decision. For the survey team, it meant that the wreck could not be cleared, dismantled, or opened for convenience. They could not conduct large-scale net removal if that work risked damaging the historic steel underneath. They could not move collapsed decking to get a better view of a blast zone. They could not dredge sediment away from buried armor plates. They could not extract metallurgical samples to test the steel. Emergency self-rescue was one thing, altering the site to improve the survey was another. Together, depth and entanglement forced the divers into slow, deliberate movement over a dangerous, net-draped hull, with buoyancy controlled closely enough to avoid striking fragile wreckage. Every movement had to be deliberate, balanced, and non-destructive. If debris blocked a critical section of torpedo damage, the obstruction had to be accepted rather than removed. The diagnostic process therefore shifted to optics, acoustics, and disciplined time at depth. That requirement pushed the survey technology hard. In 2010, a specialized expedition operating under the Explorers Club flag deployed to the Malacca Strait to document the wreck's surviving structure in a disciplined baseline survey using sound, light, and direct observation rather than salvage, excavation, or artifact removal. The foundation of this non-intrusive method is acoustic mapping. Before committing personnel to the hazardous environment, the surface team can rely on side-scan sonar to define the target and plan the dives. The survey vessel tows an acoustic array over the site, broadcasting high-frequency sound pulses down through the water column. When those pulses strike dense steel, they return strong echoes to the receiver, while the areas behind raised structure cast acoustic shadows onto the sea floor. The resulting image can show footprint, orientation, and major obstructions, but it is not a substitute for direct measurement or close visual inspection. The acoustic sweeps fixed the site's initial architecture and confirmed the target's position. Most importantly, when the divers and cameras verified the sonar contact, they confirmed a critical fact. The massive cruiser had settled on the bottom in an upright orientation. This upright posture was a distinct advantage for the documentation effort. If the ship had inverted during the sinking process, the main deck, the heavy gun batteries, and the primary superstructure would have been crushed into the sediment, rendering visual inspection far more difficult. Because she sat upright, the primary architectural features were exposed and available for optical mapping from above. Sonar fixed the frame, but blast geometry required close visual passes. The team deployed strictly controlled camera arrays to execute optical passes over the wreck. These visual sweeps were meticulously planned using the sonar map as a guide. The underwater specialists descended along the exterior plating, utilizing powerful lights to pierce the gloom, documenting the condition of the hull frame by frame. This purely visual approach required absolute discipline. The personnel recorded the complex layout of the deck gear, the alignment of the surviving gun installations, and the deformation of the armor belts. Every photograph and every minute of video footage contributed to a locked, immutable record of the site. They were freezing the condition of the warship in time, creating a forensic snapshot that required zero physical alteration of the environment. The trade-off appeared in the internal sinking mechanics. Exterior mapping could show collapsed hatches and torn plating, but it could not verify which hidden bulkheads failed or how water moved through the lower engine spaces. The surface sonar had laid down the grid, and the optical passes were filling in the details of the exterior destruction. Together, the two methods separated gross layout from structural proof. The stark discrepancy between a largely intact central architecture and a massively fractured stern creates an immediate evidence contradiction on the main hull. As the optical baseline survey progressed along the length of the cruiser, the visual data revealed a ship of two extremes. The central midship section, containing the heavy armor belts and the primary superstructure foundations, was found to be remarkably coherent. The steel plating and longitudinal framing in this central zone remained securely bound together, presenting a solid, recognizable midships mass in the silt. This intact central section provided a stable reference point for the marine engineers. However, as the camera arrays tracked aft, that structural coherence abruptly ended. Just aft of the No. 5 turret, the continuous lines of the main deck terminated in a catastrophic fracture. The survey recorded the primary hull as completely broken at this point. The engineering team documented a massive aft break, but the precise mechanics had to be treated with caution. The fracture may have reflected stresses during sinking, impact, or settling on the seabed, rather than a single provable moment of torsional failure while the stern was still afloat. As the ship flooded and descended, different sections would have loaded the hull girder in different ways, and those stresses could have been compounded when the wreck met the bottom. The visual evidence proved the break. It did not by itself prove the exact sequence of forces that produced it. Close visual mapping refined the geometry. The steel was not sheared cleanly, and thick plating and internal bulkheads were torn and warped as the aft section separated from the primary hull. That location, just aft of the No. 5 turret, became a hard structural datum while the exact loading sequence remained unresolved. Yet, when the survey team moved the camera arrays forward along the main hull to assess the primary battle damage, they encountered a fundamentally different mechanical reality. Moving past the forward superstructure, the intact deck lines vanished into a chaotic mass of shredded steel. The armor plating was driven inward, the internal framing had collapsed, and the team mapped the external perimeter of the damage zone by tracing the jagged edges where coherent structure gave way. The forward blast zone set a chapter-owned proof limit. The survey could identify or suspect several torpedo damage areas, but in the concentrated bow field, the entry points of individual weapons could not be isolated with certainty. Multiple underwater explosions, progressive flooding, collapse, and later seabed contact had overprinted one another. Without access to buried or collapsed bow structure, the team had to rely on visible, coherent evidence and cautious inference. British reports claimed at least 8 torpedo hits, while the wreck survey could document or suspect several strike zones and leave others unresolved. The exposed architecture preserved a damage pattern, not a clean mathematical tally. The mapping effort succeeded in defining the physical boundaries of the primary hull. The visual evidence locked in the upright midships, the catastrophic fracture at the aft gun position, and the unresolved forward tally. The central hull had offered up everything it legally could, but the most violent measure of the initial torpedo overpressure lay completely detached from the ship. The violent physical uprooting of a heavily armored primary turret provides a direct measurement of extreme explosive overpressure. When evaluating a combat zone where the forward primary architecture has been obliterated, investigators must look to the surrounding seabed. The silt adjacent to the shattered bow of the heavy cruiser holds a sprawling array of off-hull scatter. This debris field contains the critical components ejected during the fatal torpedo strikes and the subsequent plunge to the bottom. The most significant piece of detached evidence is the No. 1 gun installation. During visual sweeps immediately forward of the wreckage, the cameras located the No. 1 gun installation off its mount. It was no longer seated in its deck ring. The visual data showed that the armored gunhouse and the deep cylindrical barbette structure below it had been uprooted and displaced from the ship. For an explosive event to unseat this massive assembly, the blast wave had to overcome the sheer downward gravity of hundreds of tons of steel. The localized energy from the torpedo strikes channeled violently upward through the internal spaces of the forward hull. This immense pressure lifted the entire barbette and turret unit, uprooting the weapon system entirely from its foundations and throwing it clear of the sinking vessel. By fixing the exact coordinates of this uprooted turret on the seabed relative to the shattered bow, the team established a critical data point. They successfully mapped the external limits of the torpedo blast zone via this off-hull scatter, using the thrown weight to calculate the sheer geometry of the destruction. The surrounding wreck field provided further physical evidence of the catastrophic surface action and the long collapse of the upper works. The bridge, funnels, and mast structures were reported as collapsed, missing, degraded, or obscured in places by nets and corrosion. Documenting what remained visible around the hull helped the team define the broader condition of the site, but the evidence does not require every missing upper structure to have been thrown far from its original mount. The debris field expanded the historical baseline beyond the main hull, while leaving the exact separation distances and causes uncertain. However, interpreting detached off-hull debris inherently carries a strict forensic limit. Those positions fixed the end state, not the sequence. The survey team could not determine whether the massive number 1 turret was violently blown clear at the exact millisecond of the torpedo detonation, or if it tumbled out of its deep seating minutes later when the fatally damaged bow pitched downward and plummeted toward the bottom. This same chronological limitation applies to the funnels and the foremast structures. Without knowing the exact hydrodynamic forces acting upon the sinking vessel as it dropped through the water column, it is impossible to definitively separate blast ejection from drag separation. The towering mast and funnel structures may have torn away under the immense physical friction of the rapid descent. The static layout of the debris field proves exactly what structural elements ultimately fell away, but it stubbornly refuses to reveal the precise minute-by-minute order of the breakup. Even with that limit, the physical baseline was stronger than before. The off-hull debris and collapsed upperworks helped define the visible damage field, completing the rigorous, non-intrusive assessment. The structural reality of the sunken cruiser, from the displaced forward battery evidence to the damaged midships, was meticulously documented. The 2010 expedition successfully locked the historical baseline, but the deepest threat to the wreck would not be pressure, corrosion, or time, it would be enforcement. But the reality of the open ocean dictates that a legal boundary is only as strong as the physical enforcement backing it up. Reports indicate that from around 2014, and again in later investigative reporting on activity in 2022, the site was subjected to a catastrophic reversal of fortune. The protected war grave was reportedly targeted by commercial scrap operators. Public reporting and later investigations point to crane, barge, or grab dredger-style salvage, the kind of industrial process used elsewhere against wartime wrecks in the region. Unlike a surgical archaeological survey governed by strict ethical rules, this kind of salvage is mechanically violent and often poorly controlled at depth. Operators on the surface can drop heavy grabs or dredging gear through the water column onto a wreck site. When the jaws or dredging gear bite into the bottom, historic structure can be crushed, torn loose, and lifted as scrap rather than recorded as evidence. These commercial operations did not target the wreck for historical artifacts or museum displays. Their clearest immediate motive was scrap value, while one widely reported explanation for targeting wartime wrecks in the region has been the market for low background steel. Because the heavy cruiser was built before the first atomic detonations, some of her steel may have had lower background radiation than steel produced after the era of atmospheric nuclear testing. That material has sometimes been described as useful for sensitive scientific or medical shielding, though recent technical analysis disputes whether low background steel is the main driver of modern wreck looting. In practice, the safer statement is that the wreck was valuable as metal, with low background steel reported as one possible motive rather than a proven sole cause. The damage was mechanical and direct. The massive hydraulic claws tore through the upright central structure, shattered the remaining intact decking, and blindly ripped apart the entombed lower compartments. The carefully documented forensic baseline of the heavy cruiser was physically obliterated. In remote waters, the decisive weakness was practical enforcement. Without detection, prosecution, and effective Coast Guard or naval presence, commercial salvage crews operating heavy crane barges could still reach the site. This mechanized assault fundamentally changed the present management condition of the site. Any future archaeological work would now be limited to damage assessment, remote sensing, and documentation of whatever remains, because the grab dredgers did not merely remove metal, they damaged or erased the structural context that gave the wreck its scientific and historical value. The final paradox was enforcement, not ethics. The expedition's restraint protected the grave during the survey, but it offered no physical defense against later industrial operators. Once a protected wreck could be dismantled and sold for raw material, the unresolved question was whether any legal framework could protect sovereign wrecks without force, surveillance, and prosecution in the open ocean.